Welcome to the debate. Our focus today stems from Devin McClarty's really quite comprehensive analysis, Gender Accusations as Survival Strategies. Now, this document dissects the, let's face it, familiar reciprocal charges, vanity often leveled against women, and stupidity often against men. It argues these insults aren't just insults, they're actually symptomatic of these deep-seated, historically necessary survival codes that have, well, become distorted and frankly destructive in our modern world.
Right, and the material points out this misalignment leads to this really profound shared dissatisfaction. We hear that men are, quote, tired of fighting causes they don't believe in, and women feel they're, quote, drowning in attention but starving for meaning. It paints a pretty bleak picture of the current state.
It does, and so the central question for us, emerging from this analysis, is pretty critical. Does McClarty's proposed solution, which is described as a conscious and collective pivot towards purpose, meaning, and value that transcends mere performance and uncalibrated risk, does that sufficiently address and crucially dissolve these historically ingrained and, let's be honest, systemically amplified survival strategies?
That's the core of it.
And my position is yes, that this conscious pivot represents the necessary and, I believe, sufficient real work that's required here. The mutual suffering described is, I think, clear evidence that these old strategies are obsolete, which validates the absolute imperative for a fundamental shift in how we orient towards value.
And I come at it from a slightly different angle. While I find the diagnosis tying vanity and recklessness to these misaligned survival strategies incredibly insightful, I believe the proposed solution, while definitely aspirational, significantly overestimates the power of individual intent. I think it dangerously underestimates the persistent, often overwhelming force of systemic reinforcement, economic, algorithmic, evolutionary, that keeps driving these behaviors, regardless of whether someone personally wants more meaning.
Well, the core problem, according to McClarty's analysis, isn't merely that these strategies exist, but that they are now actively malfunctioning in our hyper-connected world. The analysis really breaks down how female performance for social value, which gets mislabeled, often unfairly, as vanity, is now seen as fundamentally unstable and, well, shallow. And at the same time, male action for value, that risk-taking we sometimes label as stupidity, is increasingly viewed as harmful or wasteful. The document argues, quite forcefully I think, that the only really viable path forward is to abandon these superficial metrics entirely. It cites evidence showing that sticking to the old script now produces serious negative outcomes such as dissatisfaction, depression, and social comparison, and that's across both genders. This shared frustration, this mutual realization that the performance is just exhausting and unrewarding, that serves as the critical bridge, compelling the shift towards authentic, stable purpose. I mean, if the survival code itself is actively driving you to what McClarty calls a psychological cage, the impetus to just abandon it becomes pretty overwhelming, doesn't it?
That's an interesting point, though. I guess I would frame it differently. The analysis does effectively diagnose the massive amplification of these strategies today. The social media landscape, for example, has effectively put women on a world stage, requiring them, as McClarty says, to compete globally for attention. That radically transforms and amplifies the performance part into something far more intense than, historical precedent. And similarly, the male strategy, which is supported by studies cited on risk-taking, confirms these higher-risk behaviors are deeply ingrained.
Right.
So this proposed shift to purpose requires individuals to somehow overcome these incredibly powerful, systematically reinforced drives. I'm just not convinced, based on the evidence presented about how powerful these systems are, that a purely intentional redirection can succeed when the underlying mechanisms, whether you call them evolutionary necessity or just powerful algorithmic reward systems, are still running full steam. To simply tell people, stop living for clout, kind of ignores the reality that these external systems have made clout an actual, almost fungible resource.
Okay, but
My challenge focuses directly on the resilience, the sheer stickiness of these historically rooted strategies. If we accept the historical context the document lays out, that attention functions as this immediate, vital resource for women, and risk serves as proof of immediate required value for men. The big question becomes, what replaces the power of that immediate external feedback? External rewards, social validation, maybe financial gains from performance, immediate status, they're tangible, they're high reward, they happen now. Does internal purpose, however noble, truly replace those immediate systems that constantly reinforce performance and, yes, recklessness? When a platform rewards a highly performative action instantly with resource acquisition, attention literally translating to opportunity, how can the long-term, maybe more abstract reward of purpose consistently compete with that?
I see why you think that, I do, but let me offer a different perspective, one that's really rooted in the findings McClarty presents about the psychological cost. You're focusing on the enduring nature of the external reward mechanism, sure, but the research cited that detailed review of body image and social media data. It shows the net result of actually adhering to these old strategies is overwhelmingly negative. It generates widespread dissatisfaction, depression, and social comparison.
Okay.
So the argument isn't just philosophical. It's that when the survival mechanism actively produces suffering, when the individual feels genuinely trapped in that psychological cage, the cost of maintaining the obsolete script becomes higher than the cost of abandoning it. The pivot to purpose isn't just some abstract choice, it becomes an act of psychological self-preservation. That shared dissatisfaction is the motivation. It gives the individual the strength to reject the superficial economy, regardless of its immediate shiny rewards. You could argue the system is actively punishing those who follow the old rules now, and that punishment itself acts as a powerful catalyst for change.
Let's maybe delve deeper into that tension then, the systemic amplification versus this idea of an individual opt-out. You're suggesting that when individuals recenter on authenticity, the insults dissolve, which implies the external pressure only keeps its power if the individual chooses to buy into that false metric of validation. The shift to purpose, in your view, is the mechanism for consciously and successfully opting out of the whole world stage competition.
Exactly.
However, the analysis itself poses this really provocative and I think crucial question. If women weren't forced to perform on a world stage, would vanity even be a complaint? Now that strongly suggests that the root of the complaint is actually external compulsion, reinforced by economic and social structures. We're not just talking about minor incentives here. We're talking about, billion-dollar clout economies and algorithmic structures specifically designed to maximize engagement through performance.
I acknowledge the scale.
Right. So while the individual intent to stop living for clout is noble, it doesn't actually change the fact that the external system rewards performance intensely. If choosing the purposeful, authentic route results in being significantly disadvantaged economically or socially, like reduced visibility, fewer opportunities, less access to resources, then isn't it possible that individual intentionality alone just isn't sufficient to counteract those pervasive, constantly reinforced systemic forces, the very forces driving the behaviors McClarty wants to dissolve?
That's a compelling argument, and I absolutely agree the scale of the systemic pressure is immense. But I think we need to be precise about what purpose means in this context, as McClarty lays it out. It's not meant to be a passive withdrawal. It's framed as an active, structural decision that fundamentally changes the metric of success. So if a woman bases her value on competence, or mastery, or specific productive contribution, a definition derived from genuine purpose, then the performance economy literally offers nothing she needs. The psychological energy that was previously allocated to just being visible gets redirected to creation, to substance.
Redirects.
The whole point of the McClarty analysis, as I read it, is that the moment the internal metric becomes authentic, the external rewards of shallow validation just lose their currency. They stop functioning as resources because the person is no longer defining their survival or their value through those external metrics. Yes, the system still rewards performance, absolutely, but the individual simply stops playing that particular game because the prize itself has become meaningless to their new definition of self-worth. The psychological liberation from the cage is the higher reward, outweighing the old external ones.
Okay, let's pivot slightly. we face a parallel and I think equally challenging issue when we talk about the male strategy of risk. The analysis rightly asks a critical question. When does strong risk cross into recklessness, and who sets that boundary? Now, if the boundary is set only by individual purpose, that seems to create significant ambiguity, particularly when that risk impacts other people.
Right.
The document warns that misaligned risk can fuel, quote, pointless ego battles or reckless gambles that leave families in ruin. So if a man's purpose is defined internally as, say, achieving massive success for my family, but his method involves uncalibrated risk that ends up bankrupting them, well, his intent was technically purposeful, wasn't it? Doesn't this lack of a communal or maybe objective framework for calibration suggest that individual intent, even if authentic, might be insufficient protection against the harmful spillover effects of uncalibrated action?
Well, I'm not quite convinced by that line of reasoning, primarily because I think it conflates what might be self-serving ambition with what McClarty defines as authentic purpose. The misalignment, as the document details repeatedly, is the core problem. The analysis challenges men specifically to stop standing for causes you don't believe in. And that, I think, includes performing aggressive risk just to signal prowess or, frankly, protect a fragile ego.
So you're saying authentic purpose wouldn't lead there?
I believe authentic purpose, almost by definition within this framework, requires a degree of responsibility and strategic foresight that inherently shifts the risk calculation. When strong risk is aligned with genuine purpose, like, say, building something sustainable or protecting communal well-being, the expenditure of energy stops being a reckless gamble and becomes a calculated investment of power. A truly purposeful act, I'd argue, has to integrate its potential impact. If the risk actively harms those the purpose intends to serve, like the family example, then arguably the purpose was inherently flawed or perhaps inauthentic to begin with. The boundary, therefore, is set by the authenticity and the depth of the purpose itself. It ensures the risk taken is constructive, moving the individual and their circle towards sustainable value, rather than just squandering resources in a performance. The sufficiency of the solution lies in this re-internalized calibration.
A high bar for authenticity, then.
Ultimately, I believe the thesis holds. The solution must be this radical redirection of energy away from these exhausting, performance-driven roles towards core meaning and authenticity. This pivot is presented as the only mechanism that truly dissolves the mutual accusations of vanity and stupidity, which are positioned as simply the destructive relics of misunderstood survival codes that have become dysfunctional. The widespread dissatisfaction McClarty documents proves the old game just isn't worth the candle anymore, making the internal pivot both the necessary and sufficient next step toward mutual liberation.
Look, the diagnosis McClarty provides, demonstrating how vanity and stupidity function as these mirror accusations rooted in historical survival codes, that's undeniably critical. It gives us a lens for understanding our current cultural friction. However, I do maintain caution regarding the sufficiency of the proposed remedy. While purpose is foundational, absolutely necessary for navigating modernity, the sheer complexity and intensity of the systemic pressures we've discussed, particularly the algorithmic and economic forces that reward performance and recklessness almost instantly, suggests that individual intentionality alone might be insufficient. The system itself probably needs to be addressed alongside individual intention if we want this new sense of purpose to truly thrive without facing constant punishing friction from the outside.
So regardless of whether the conscious pivot is fully sufficient on its own, or perhaps just the most necessary first step, McClarty's analysis certainly highlights the critical nature of what's called the shared predicament. It underscores the deep internal work required from everyone to move past these destructive cycles.
Absolutely. It forces us to confront the fact that we probably can't solve a structural problem without first addressing the very personal metrics we each use to define our own value. There's certainly a lot more to unpack in the material.